23 American specialists, 2 generators, satellite dishes worth millions of dollars, and total silence on the airwaves. While the CIA team listened to empty Iraqi air, 4 Australians just 300 meters away already knew what the Americans had failed to find. Then they asked the Americans to pack up their gear and go. No shouting, no accusations, just leave. This happened in March 2003 in Iraq's western desert, and you won't find it in the official Pentagon chronicles. The temperature had climbed past 42 degrees Celsius, 107 degrees Fahrenheit, before noon. The heat shimmered over the sand so intensely that the horizon turned into a mirage. It was here, in this boiling nothingness, that a story unfolded, one that still causes a dull irritation in certain circles at Langley. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, an elite unit that the average American in 2003 knew nothing about, did in 48 hours what 23 specialists with a full arsenal of technical intelligence would have spent another week on. And even then, they wouldn't have succeeded, because they were looking in the wrong place, in the wrong way. But to understand why this was possible, we have to start a little earlier and go significantly deeper. By the start of the March 2003 invasion, the American intelligence machine was perhaps the most technologically advanced in human history. RQ-1 Predator drones loitered at 15,000 feet, beaming real-time video to command centers thousands of miles from the theater of war. NSA ground stations intercepted transmissions on frequencies the Iraqi army didn't even know existed. Satellite imagery was refreshed every 6 hours. CIA analytical groups worked 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The coalition's technological superiority over Saddam's army was so overwhelming that some officers in Washington seriously discussed the possibility of _0_ victory through air power and intelligence alone, without a massive ground invasion. It was the war of the future, which America intended to win before the enemy even realized it had begun. The Australians watched all this with polite, expressionless faces. It is the same look an experienced mechanic gives a neighbor who has bought the most expensive tool set in the store but has no idea how to take an engine apart. It wasn't arrogance, it was experience. And that experience had a specific geography and a specific date. By 2003, the SASR had been through Vietnam, operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, East Timor, and, most crucially, Afghanistan after 9/11. It was in Afghanistan, in the mountains of Tora Bora and the valleys of Helmand, that Australian operators gained something no academy or simulator can provide: a practical understanding of how intelligence works in an environment where the enemy doesn't use radios, lacks a predictable chain of command, and dissolves into the civilian population like sugar in hot water. This experience was worth more than any satellite dish, but it didn't look impressive on PowerPoint slides at the Pentagon. Even more importantly, Australian Special Operations doctrine had already undergone a painful but necessary transformation. In the 1990s, SASR, like most Western Special Forces, was built primarily as a direct action unit. Find, destroy, exfiltrate. Afghanistan broke that model. Not because direct action stopped working, it did work, but because it became obvious that every successful direct action mission carried out without an intelligence base created 3 new enemies for everyone neutralized. The Australian command reached this conclusion faster than most of its allies, and it was with this conclusion that the SASR arrived in Iraq. The geography of the task deserves separate mention. Iraq's western desert isn't just a quote-to in the tourist sense. It is a territory of about 150,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of England, but without roads, railways, cities, or any infrastructure that could be considered modern. Rare Bedouin settlements, ancient trade routes, wells known only to locals, and an absolute inhuman silence at night. It was in this silence that the '3 were hiding, or what was left of them after the First Gulf War. The Scud issue is vital because it explains why the western sector became a priority. After the 1991 war, Iraq officially destroyed most of its ballistic missiles under UN supervision. Officially. Intelligence estimates circulating in London, Washington, and Canberra between 1998 and 2003 suggested that 6 to 12 operational launchers or components might remain in the western sector. These missiles, if equipped with the right warheads, could reach Israel. Israel might retaliate, and then the war the coalition planned to finish in weeks would turn into something fundamentally different. That is why neutralizing the western sector was at the top of the Phase 1 priority list, right alongside capturing the southern oil fields and taking Baghdad. This is where the CIA team arrived. The group of American technical specialists appeared at the forward operating base about 3 days after the Australians had already settled in. 23 people, not counting security. 4 cargo trucks full of equipment. 2 generators powerful enough to light a small village. Satellite antennas that took an hour and a half to deploy and could be seen for miles, which, in the desert's perfect visibility, turned the position into something halfway between a listening post and a lighthouse. A new generation SIGINT, Signals Intelligence System, capable, according to its creators, of detecting any enemy activity within a 150-kilometer radius. Laptops, encrypted channels to Langley, several analysts with PhDs, and 1 senior officer. Let's just call him _5_ as his real name remains hidden behind a string of letters in declassified materials, who brought with him a sense of his own indispensability that weighed about as much as all his equipment combined. Colonel Reed held his first briefing the next morning. He outlined the plan: deploy the intercept system, map radio frequency activity in the sector, identify command nodes of Iraqi missile units, and relay coordinates to the Air Force for a strike. A good strategy. Technically flawless. Logically sound. It would have worked perfectly, in one single case, if the enemy were using radios. The Iraqi Scud operators were not using radios. They had received this order back in the 90s after the first Gulf War, when American intelligence demonstrated terrifying accuracy in tracking Iraqi missile units specifically through radio intercepts. The Iraqi military learned its lesson quickly, unlike those who thought they were incapable of institutional learning. Since then, missile brigade commanders had switched to couriers, visual signals, and prearranged action plans that required no radio chatter. Movement routes changed unpredictably. Columns moved at night without lights, on roads not marked on any modern map. In the western desert of 2003, the airwaves were almost empty, and that in itself was the answer the CIA team wasn't prepared to hear. $50 million of equipment, 23 specialists, and total silence where the enemy should have been. Worst of all, no one on the team understood that the silence was the tactic. While the American specialists were unfolding antennas and waiting for databases to fill, 4 Australians from an SASR patrol were already working differently. Their method didn't require generators, satellite links, or PhD-level analysts. It required only 2 things: the ability to listen and the willingness to take off their helmets. SASR doctrine regarding intelligence gathering in sparsely populated areas is built on a principle officially termed _7_. In practice, this means, before you look for the enemy, you must understand how life works for the people in that territory. Who walks here and when? Which routes do the shepherds use? Where are the wells? Which village elders hold authority? Which trucks appeared in the area in the last 2 weeks, and where were they headed? This isn't high technology. This is anthropology applied to the tasks of war. Australian SASR operators received specialized training in the languages and cultural nuances of the region. Not all of them, and not to full fluency. The army is the army, but enough to establish basic contact with the local population without a translator. Enough to correctly interpret a gesture, a pause in conversation, or a change in a caravan's route. Enough so that a local shepherd, grazing sheep 20 kilometers from nowhere, perceived them not as occupiers, but as people you could actually talk to. That is why they took off their helmets. They put away their sunglasses. They got out of their vehicles and sat on the ground next to those who had always lived there and knew the desert better than any satellite. And in that gesture, simple, almost invisible, lay the entire difference between 2 approaches to war. One approach told the enemy, "We are technologically stronger than you, and you cannot hide from us." The other told the local resident, "We see a human being in you, and what you know matters to us." The difference in results was as vast as the difference in messages. It is worth describing specifically what the Australian patrol's fieldwork looked like, because romanticized descriptions of, quote, 10 often hide a grueling operational reality. The patrol moved in Land Rover Parentes, an Australian modification of the classic 4x4, developed specifically for desert conditions. The vehicle is light, maneuverable, and unarmored. This wasn't a design flaw or a budget constraint. It was a conscious choice. Heavy armor in the desert leaves tracks, makes noise, and consumes fuel in quantities incompatible with autonomous 12-day sorties. A light vehicle means freedom of maneuver, speed of reaction, and crucially, the ability to stop where a regular trader or shepherd would stop without immediately alerting the whole neighborhood. Movement was carried out primarily at night, with lights off, using night vision. During the day, the group occupied concealed positions and conducted observation. Contacts with the local population occurred at dawn and in the evening, when shepherds moved their livestock, traders finished their day's route, and people were most inclined to talk. Not because they were being persuaded, but because a tired person at the end of the day offered a seat and something hot to drink, someone who looks them in the eye rather than over their head. That person talks. This isn't an intelligence trick. This is basic human psychology. Information gathered this way wasn't written in notebooks or entered into databases in real time. It was memorized, cross-referenced within the group, and transmitted by voice over a secure satellite link to the headquarters level once or twice a day. The absence of written notes wasn't negligence. It was another conscious choice. Notes can be lost, intercepted, or misinterpreted. The trust of a source toward an operator who doesn't pull out a notebook at every word is an asset that no paper can replace. In the first 48 hours in the sector, the SASR patrol established contact with 3 separate local sources. This doesn't mean they recruited agents in the classical sense. No deals, no payments, no receipts. It means conversations happened. The right questions were asked. The right people felt enough respect to answer. According to declassified fragments of Australian command reporting, notably in the work of David Kilcullen and materials from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, it was the human intelligence obtained by ground patrols in the early days of the operation that became the primary source of data on the movement of transport columns linked to missile units. The numbers speak for themselves. By the end of the 3rd day, the Australian patrol had concrete coordinates for 2 points requiring immediate airstrikes and a movement schedule that allowed them to predict the appearance of columns in a specific grid with an accuracy of a few hours. None of this was obtained through radio intercept. All of it was obtained through conversations with people who saw with their own eyes what no satellite could see. Heavy tire tracks on night roads, the smell of exhaust at dawn, the sound of heavy machinery moving over soft ground in the dark. The CIA team, by this point, had finished deployment and was operating in standard mode. Their system was picking up fragments of encrypted transmissions from Iraqi army units hundreds of kilometers to the east. This data was valuable. It just had nothing to do with what they were looking for in this specific sector. 2 completely different results, 2 completely different methods, and one shared desert in which they could not work together. On the 4th day, the Australian group's operations officer requested an airstrike through coalition headquarters on one of the 2 identified points. The request went through the standard approval procedure, which included verification by coalition intelligence structures. Essentially the same people from the CIA team sitting 300 meters away from the Australian position. The American liaison officer requested documentation. On what basis was the conclusion reached about the target's military significance? What is the source of information? Is there technical confirmation? Drone footage? SIGINT data? Signal intelligence? The Australian operator answered honestly. The source is a local resident. Confirmation is visual observation by the ground patrol. There is no technical confirmation. The request hung in the approval process for 22 hours. That is exactly how much time the system needed to acknowledge that data obtained from a human is not equal to data obtained from a machine. 22 hours, and in that time, the suspected column completed its route and dispersed. The airstrike hit an empty spot. The human data had been accurate, but the window of opportunity slammed shut because the system demanded technical confirmation of something that is not technically verifiable by its very nature. The senior American liaison officer reportedly made the following entry in the log. Intelligence data cannot be verified by established procedures. It was the truth. It was also a disaster. Now ask yourself, how many such windows slammed shut throughout the entire war? It was after this episode that what is officially called a coordination meeting, and what those who were there call something else, took place. A conversation occurred between the Australian command on the ground and the CIA operational group. Calm, businesslike, and final. No shouting, no accusations, no appeals to the chain of command. Just a surgically precise statement of fact. The working methods of the 2 groups were incompatible in this operational context. The parallel presence created procedural delays that zeroed out the value of time-sensitive intelligence. One member of the Australian group reportedly phrased it this way: "Your system was built for a different war. It's a good system, but here and now, it's in our way." Colonel Reid apparently found no flaw in this argument, because there was no flaw. Within the next 24 hours, the CIA technical group packed up their equipment, loaded their generators and antennas, and left the position. The official wording in the operational logs was neutral, redeployment due to shift in priorities. Those who were there knew what really happened. 4 Australians asked 23 Americans with all their millions of dollars of equipment to take their toys and leave, and the Americans left. This, of course, is not the end of the story. It is the middle. And what followed explains why this episode still crops up in professional discussions on intelligence methodology 20 years later. After the American group left, the Australian patrol continued working in its usual mode. For the next 12 days, and the duration of this specific sortie, the group operated independently, communicating with headquarters via encrypted satellite channels and requesting air support only when they had data sufficient to justify an immediate strike. No 22-hour delays, no requirement for technical verification of human. Data went directly and was used directly. The logic was this: the patrol moved along routes determined by terrain analysis and source data, not preset operational schemes. Contacts with locals were made at dawn and dusk. Information accumulated in layers. Every new conversation either confirmed previous data or pointed to a contradiction requiring verification. No notes to be lost. Everything was kept in memory and relayed by voice. This method, what would later be called accumulating ecological intelligence in counterinsurgency theory, created the inequity of result observed by American liaison officers. Inequity in the sense that the result did not match the resources. 4 men without satellite dishes produced an intelligence product comparable in quality and superior in operational utility to what 23 specialists with a full technical suite could offer in those conditions. This doesn't mean the method was flawless, far from it. Autonomous SASR patrols in the western sector worked under what is euphemistically called, quote, 22. Behind that euphemism lies this reality: a 4-man group, 150 to 200 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces, could expect exfiltration in a best-case scenario of several hours if they hit a contact or a vehicle breakdown, and only if coordinates were accurate, the weather held, and the enemy hadn't closed the zone. That's not a tactical calculation. It's a bet people made every day they went out. By 2003, the Australian Army had enough experience with such bets not to romanticize them. SASR operators are people who have gone through years of selection and training, consciously choosing this work. No conscious choice doesn't cancel the physical and psychological price the work takes. And here, the story of the 4 Australians in the desert turns toward a side the tabloid format usually prefers to skip. The method that yielded such results had a price, and that price wasn't abstract. Working in small groups without heavy armor deep in enemy territory isn't just a smarter way to fight in the sense used in Defense Ministry marketing. It is a constant, minute-by-minute existence in a zone where one mistake in situational assessment, one misread intention of a source, one encounter with an enemy patrol without the possibility of a quick retreat could end in the death of the entire group, without any hope of outside help. SASR operators understood this better than anyone, but understanding a risk and being habituated to it are fundamentally different things. The psychological burden of working in such conditions for months and multiple tours is described by veterans not as stress in the common sense, but as a state of constant hypervigilance that is extremely difficult to switch off. Several veterans of the SASR and the 2nd Commando Regiment, in interviews with Australian journalists and researchers between 2010 and 2020, described returning home as one of the hardest transitions of their lives. Not because home was bad, but because normal civilian life required turning off mechanisms that had been running at redline for years. The system was built for war. For peace, it didn't come with an uninstallation manual. And here arises a question that journalism and military history usually prefer not to ask out loud. Does a system become more effective because of its ability to squeeze everything out of people, without creating mechanisms to protect them from the consequences? The Australian Army was not, and is not, an exception to this rule. The gap between what war demands and what peace offers exists in the Australian case just as it does in the American one. This doesn't make the results less real. It makes them less clear-cut. And it is important to remember this whenever a story about professionalism risks turning into a legend of infallibility. There is another level of complexity this episode raises beyond the technical discussion of intelligence methods. Working through a local population in an active war is always a navigation of a gray zone. The person who told the Australian patrol about the column movements was acting on their own motives. Maybe sympathy for the coalition, maybe fear, maybe as part of their own local conflicts and interests that the patrol didn't and couldn't know about. A source's motivation is always opaque, while the result of using their information is always concrete. Military history knows plenty of examples where intelligence from human sources turned out to be the result of settling scores, false reports, or unintentional perception errors. Declassified materials give no reason to claim this happened here. No, the silence of the sources is itself a data point. Productive intelligence and ethically flawless intelligence are not synonyms, and people who do this work well know this better than anyone else. That is why true professionals never call their work a, quote, 26 out loud, because, quote, 27 implies a clean outcome, and clean outcomes do not exist in this profession. After leaving the Western sector, the CIA team redeployed to a zone with a different operational context, where the density of enemy radio traffic was sufficient for the SIGINT system to work. There, their equipment performed exactly as intended. This is important to note because the story of 4 Australians _quote_28_23 Americans, the kind of phrasing that floats around veteran forums and specialized journals, is a story of a tool not matching the task rather than the universal superiority of one method over another. The technical intelligence system the CIA team brought was designed for a specific type of enemy. An enemy that uses radios, has a predictable command structure, and operates in an information space dense enough to leave electronic footprints. Against the Iraqi regular army in much of the theater, this system worked as designed. The Western Desert was the exception, and it was this exception that revealed a limitation known to specialists but ignored during planning. This isn't stupidity, it's institutional inertia, found in any large bureaucracy, military or civilian. This is where the real fault line lies. The American system was designed top-down. Analysts at Langley determined what data was needed. Engineers built tools to collect it, and operators deployed those tools in the field. This is an efficient model for a predictable enemy. The Australian system worked bottom-up. The operator in the field determined what was needed for a specific task in a specific environment and used whatever was available, including their own common sense, cultural knowledge, and ability to connect with people. It's not a better or worse model in an absolute sense. It is a different model. And in the Western Desert of Iraq in March 2003, it was the model that fit the task. It's no coincidence that the American military command didn't arrive at this conclusion in 2003, or 2004, or even 2005. It arrived there in 2006, at the cost of Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and hundreds of operations that were technically successful but strategically meaningless. Correct frameworks rarely make headlines. That is why the story of the 4 Australians lives on in its tabloid version. And that version, for all its simplification, contains the grain that explains its longevity. That grain isn't that Australians are better. It's that the American system in 2003 suffered from a systemic inability to recognize the limits of a technological approach in specific contexts. This isn't a question of tactics. It is a question of institutional culture, which equated technological superiority with intelligence superiority, and intelligence superiority with victory. An equation that didn't work automatically in any of its 3 parts, but it was convenient enough to believe in. This is why, in 2006, when David Petraeus was developing the new counterinsurgency doctrine FM3-24, he included principles that SASR ground patrols were using back in 2003. Human terrain mapping. Working with the local population as the primary intelligence source. Priority of HUMINT over SIGINT in low radio environments. Limiting the use of force when kinetic action creates more enemies than it neutralizes. All of this sounded revolutionary in 2006. All of it sounded like a standard operating procedure for 4 Australians in the Western Desert 3 years earlier. An intellectual approach to war. That's how Petraeus described the principles of FM3-24 in an interview. 4 dusty Australians were using that approach 3 years before it got an official name and a field manual number. While an American team with 2 generators and a satellite dish listened to empty air 150 kilometers away from anything that mattered. But here's what no official document will say, and what is perhaps the most important context for understanding this whole story. While those 4 Australians in 2003 were figuring out which trucks were driving at night, in another part of Iraq, processes were beginning that would eventually spawn what the world would know as ISIS. Sunni districts, where coalition forces entered with the roar of sweeps and the unintended humiliation of civilians, were becoming breeding grounds for radicalization faster than any intelligence could track it. The ignored data from field groups, not just Australian, but American and British too. Anyone who worked closely enough with the population to hear what was happening, regarding growing Sunni alienation, what was happening in internment camps, and how the lustration of the former Iraqi army was turning trained, armed men into unemployed men with a personal grudge. That data went up the chain of command, and there it sat. 4 dusty Australians won a tactical episode. The war was lost at a level where tactical victories mean nothing. Not because anyone was stupid or malicious, but because a system built to defeat a specific enemy by specific means had no mechanism to process information that didn't fit its categories. A local saying his neighbor hates the occupiers and will take up arms in a month isn't intelligence data in a format processed by a SIGINT system. It's a human being telling the truth. And that truth wasn't enough to change the course of the war. To understand the scale of the gap between the two approaches, look at how each system traveled the path from information to action. The American chain looked like this: signal intercept, decryption, analysis at Langley, data to HQ, command approval, airstrike. In a radio-rich environment, this chain gave results in hours. A great system for an enemy that uses radios. The Australian chain was shorter and more ruthless. Conversation with source, cross-referencing, on-site assessment, voice via secure channel, strike. No middlemen, no requirement for technical verification of the unverifiable. Data went from human to human, and that is why it worked. But here's the truly lethal part of the comparison. The American system was designed to eliminate human error, to replace an operator's subjective judgment with objective instrument data. The Australian system was designed to maximize the quality of human judgment, through selection, training, and trust in the operator in the field. The first model assumes the human is the source of error. The second assumes the human is the only real intelligence tool in an environment without an airwave signature. In the Western Desert in 2003, the second model was right, and that wasn't just a random result of one mission. It was a verdict on an entire philosophy of war. The American command, of course, didn't stay blind to the obvious. Starting around 2006, the Pentagon launched the Human Terrain Teams (HTT) program. The essence: attach a group of culture and language specialists to every combat brigade to do exactly what the 4 Australians had done 3 years prior. On paper, a brilliant idea. In practice, a partial failure, for reasons obvious to everyone except those signing the checks. A method that worked in the hands of operators with years of specialized training and real-world experience did not scale to thousands of soldiers who took a 2-week Arabic course and a 6-hour briefing on local customs. Human terrain intelligence isn't a skill you issue with a field manual. It is a quality of personality built over years. You can't copy it like you copy a tactical diagram. The failure of the HTT wasn't just an operational disappointment. It was a proof by contradiction. Proof that what the 4 Australians did in the desert wasn't a reproducible tactic, but the result of a training system the American Army hadn't built and had no intention of building. Too long, too expensive, too unlike the war the Pentagon was used to winning. It was easier to buy another antenna and wait for a signal in a silent desert. Australia, meanwhile, sent about 2,000 troops to Iraq at its peak, fewer than the U.S. Marines lost in a single heavy month in Fallujah. Prime Minister John Howard decided to participate despite the fact that most Australians didn't support the war. 2003 polls were unambiguous. Howard gambled that the professionalism of a small contingent would create disproportionate military value and secure Canberra a seat at the table with Washington. The calculation proved correct. The 4 men in the Western Desert were its most precise embodiment. But that calculation had a price. And in Canberra, they preferred not to talk about it. A war that much of Australian society considered illegal was being fought by a unit that did its job better than anyone else in the entire theater. The professionalism of the executors and the doubtfulness of the political mandate existed side by side, neither canceling the other out for a second. This contradiction remains unresolved to this day. Every time a story about SASR operations in Iraq surfaces in the Australian public sphere, it drags this tale behind it. That is why official Canberra prefers this story to stay in specialized journals, rather than on the front pages of Sunday newspapers. General Petraeus called the correct method an intellectual approach to war. But in 2003, at Coalition HQ, intelligence reports on the human factor were simply stamped with one word: ignored. By the time the lesson was learned, the war had changed forever, and those who, in March 2003, took off their helmets and sat on the ground with shepherds in the western Iraqi desert, knew it before anyone else.